Okay, this is video 2 in our assessment set of slides. And the place where we left off in the last video was distinguishing classroom and standardized assessment and saying that really we're going to focus on classroom assessment. So assessment that you as a teacher have quite a bit of control over in the classroom. And so on the previous slide, we made a whole list of different types of assessments that we see in the classroom. And we can add some more. So papers, exit tickets, um, group work, if there's some kind of project, let's write that. So we can think of lots and lots of different types of assessments. And so the first distinction that we're going to draw in classroom assessment is between formative and summative assessment. And so you can pause the video right here and thinking about all of the different types of assessments that we identified on the previous slide, you can sort these and decide, okay, are these formative or summative assessment and why? And so what we're going to do now is distinguish and discuss the similarities between formative and summative assessment. And when I talk about formative assessment, I mean something like homework. And when I talk about summative assessment, I mean something like a unit test. And so pause the video right here, and you're going to do two things. So first, sort each of these types of assessment and decide if it's formative or summative. So do the sort. And then see if you can come up with at least 3 differences between formative and summative assessment. And I'm going to create a table and go through the differences with you. But pause the video and really see if you can come up with some contrasts for yourself. And I'm going to put a table, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to put a table over my Venn diagram so I can organize my contrasts more easily, and then we'll talk about similarities. And so I suspect that many of you are familiar with formative versus summative assessment for other classes. But these are kind of the kinds of differences that we talk about when we talk about formative versus summative assessment. And so the first distinction to draw is when they happen. Formative assessment typically happens during instruction, so during the course of a unit, whereas summative assessment happens after instruction. After I'm done teaching is when my summative assessment takes place. So we can distinguish these according to when in relation to instruction they happen. And I don't have the term here, but we can actually talk about a third type of assessment, which is diagnostic assessment, which is another way of saying a pretest. And so again, think about what we mean when we say a doctor giving you a diagnosis. And diagnostic assessment happens before instruction. So before I teach you any new content, I can give you a pretest to see what you already know and to help me plan for instruction. But we're not going to talk about diagnostic assessment as much, just so that you have the term. And I'll just stick it up here so that you know that that's kind of where our assessment process starts. But otherwise, we can talk about formative assessment as happening during instruction, summative assessment as happening after instruction. So from that, a lot of different contrasts flow. So first, formative assessment is typically over limited content. So I would give formative assessment as a homework assignment. I would give formative assessment if we just talked about something. I do a quick think, pair, share, or an exit ticket, but it basically refers to the one unit that I just taught. Whereas summative assessment covers much more content. It covers typically, and so again, these are kind of relative terms, but we can think about summative assessment as covering a great deal larger chunk of information. And because of that, because formative assessment tends to cover less information and summative assessment tends to cover more information, they're also different in the kind of information they cover. So again, if we think about the distinction between homework assignments versus something like a unit test, formative assessment tends to cover more specific content, so it tends to cover kind of what we just did in class, whereas summative assessment tends to cover more thematic content, or thinking about connections between content. So for example, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to ask on a formative assessment necessarily, what are the key themes in this book, right? Because we just talked about chapter 1 today. So you don't really know the themes in the book yet. That would be, but on a test, when I'm asking you to think about the whole book or a more substantial piece of content, we can also think about more thematic content or connections between content. So there's a little bit of a difference in the kind of content that's addressed with each of these forms of assessment. Let me arrange my slide a little bit so it's a little bit more attractive for you guys. There we go. Okay. So related to that, formative assessment tends to be low stakes. So in some classes, you'll hear that formative assessment has to be absolutely ungraded. And so by what I mean by stakes is I mean kind of point value. And so I don't think it has to be ungraded, but it has to be either ungraded or a low point value. So, you know, like a 5-point homework assignment that I'm just grading for completion. Summative assessment tends to be high point value. Again, because I'm grading a lot of content, it's after instruction is done, and I'm grading kind of more thematically. And so as a result, these also differ in the kind of learning that I'm trying to get for students. When I'm talking about formative assessment, I'm really measuring students' progress, how students are mastering intermittent sections of the unit. But I don't necessarily have the expectation that students definitely know how to do something. Whereas for summative assessment, I'm really measuring learning in the sense of I want to know what students are able to perform. So we can think about formative assessment as measuring progress, kind of how students are developing their particular skills. Whereas by the time we get to summative assessment, I would expect those skills to be developed. And so what that means is these formative and summative assessment also have a different relationship to instruction. And so let me insert a row below. And so what that means is and so this also corresponds to when they happen, either during or after instruction. But basically, formative assessment informs my instruction in a big way. In fact, that's a good mnemonic. Formative assessment informs instruction. And what that means is my students, we've done a lesson for today. I give them a quick exit ticket with 3 questions. And I see that a lot of students in my class answered one of the questions incorrectly. Well, that tells me that, you know, the next day I have to go back and reteach a part of that unit. So it helps with iterative planning. Whereas summative assessment summarizes, again a mnemonic, summarizes learning. And so what that means is it helps me evaluate my instruction kind of at the unit level, but it doesn't, the instruction is over, so there's not necessarily an easy way for me to go back and reteach. It kind of summarizes the learning in students in terms of what has happened as a result of the whole unit. So they're different in their kind of purpose. I'm trying to think if there's other big differences. Again, so kind of going along with low stakes, formative assessment, let me talk about format. That's important. Let me add a row. These also tend to differ in format. So what I mean by that is, again, because they're low stakes and because they cover more specific and more limited content, you tend to have more formative assessment and you tend to have more frequent formative assessment. Whereas when we're talking about summative assessment, more frequent. I shouldn't type and talk at the same time. When we're talking about summative assessment, you have fewer of them, again, because they're worth more points, fewer of them, and you tend to have them less frequently. And the other final contrast that I want to talk about is in terms of learner awareness. So in the case of formative assessment, learners may not be aware that they're being assessed, whereas in summative assessment, learners typically are aware. What does that mean? So again, this goes hand in hand with whether something is low stakes or high stakes. When we're talking about high stakes assessment, when we're talking about summative assessment, because it's high stakes, which is another way of saying it has a high point value, learners are typically aware that they're being assessed. And that sometimes, in fact, particularly with older students, we ask students to prepare for summative assessment. So you would study for a test, or you would study for a quiz, or you would spend some time writing your paper because you know you're being graded on it. So learners are very aware of that assessment. So it feels high stakes for them. And as a contrast, when we're talking about formative assessment, learners may not even be aware that they're being assessed. So for example, of course, students know that they're answering a question in class, or of course they know that students they're filling out an exit ticket, but they may not be deliberate in studying to complete an exit ticket, or they may not be as conscious, they may not kind of devote time and effort to preparing for an assessment. So formative assessment is what happens during the course of instruction, whereas summative assessment is what happens after instruction. And so we can put more expectations on students in order to prepare for that assessment. And so the question I'll ask you now is thinking about diagnostic assessment. Would we say that that's a formative or a summative type of assessment? And take a pause and decide if it's formative or summative and why. So if you've restarted the video, we can say that diagnostic assessment is actually a subtype of formative assessment because although it doesn't happen during instruction, it happens before instruction rather than at the end. And it tends to be low stakes. We don't grade diagnostic assessments. They just help us plan or inform our instruction. So in some ways, we can think about diagnostic assessment as a subtype of formative assessment. So hopefully you have the distinctions between formative and summative assessment. Let's talk about some similarities. And so for that, I'm going to actually put a text box on top of these. And let me give it a color so that we're not confused. This is becoming an interesting formatting fiasco. Okay, so let's talk about similarities between them. So first, these are both forms of assessment. And so what that means is that in both cases, we are gathering data about student progress. And I should say, pause the video and see if you can come up with at least 2 similarities of your own. But here are mine. So first, these are both types of assessment, right? In the sense of we're collecting data on student learning. The other thing to know is that in both cases, these are teacher-directed. And that sounds pretty obvious, but I do want to point out that you as a teacher are responsible for both types of these assessments. You're responsible for both formative and summative assessment. And by teacher-directed, what I mean is, going back to our very definition of classroom assessment, you're responsible for everything. So you are responsible for designing it, implementing it, scoring it, drawing conclusions based on it. And so I said that these are both types of assessment, and depending on the kind of formative assessment you're doing, both of them will give you information that's associated with both measurement and evaluation. So I can see, how complete is your exit ticket? Did you answer all 3 questions is kind of the measurement. And I can judge whether or not you understood the content well as a result. They're both teacher-directed. So again, you're responsible. So you are a teacher collecting data or assessment from students. They both take a variety of formats in the classroom. So I can have exit tickets, homework, worksheets, graphic organizers, talk to your neighbor. On the summative end, I can have papers, projects, tests, kind of, what do you call those, quests, where you kind of do some kind of series of activities, anything for summative assessment. So I have to decide on format. But in both cases, they are tied to instruction. And so later in the class, we'll be talking about the relationship between assessment and instruction. But in both cases, it's important to point out that these are forms of classroom assessment. And what that means is both formative and summative assessment are related to what you did as a teacher and what you're going to do as a teacher. And so those are kind of the similarities to think about when we're talking about formative and summative assessment. One more distinction to draw, and that's between formal and informal assessment. And so I'm just going to take this box away because we're not going to talk about developmental differences for now. And let me give this a title, Forms of Assessment. And so we talked about formative and summative assessment, and the distinction I'm going to draw now is between formal and informal assessment. And so I'm going to ask you to pause the video here and see if you can come up with an example of something that you would consider to be formal, let's say formative assessment, versus informal formative assessment, a type of classroom assessment. And so I will give you 2 examples. When we're talking about, oh, you know what? I have contrasts on the previous slide. I apologize. I don't think I animated this correctly. Let me duplicate this slide so I can, because I don't want to go to that table first. Okay, so let me delete everything we did here. And I think if I animated this the way I think I did, formal and informal assessment should come up. Maybe not. Okay, so then I'm going to contrast formal and informal assessment right here just so it's easier for you to see than seeing on this table. So the thing that we're doing, and I apologize for this whole back and forth, but the thing that we're doing is coming up with an example of something that would be formal versus informal, let's say formative assessment for now. And so the two examples I'll give for formal and informal, let me switch these because well, this is good. So for formal, I would say formal formative assessment is something like a homework assignment, whereas informal assessment is something like asking questions in class and getting an answer from students. So what is the difference between these? So take a minute and think about what's the difference between assigning a homework assignment versus just asking questions. And let me copy and paste this table so that you got, well, I can make a new table, so that we're able to have contrasts for formal and informal assessment. There's really not as many differences. Okay. So if you've come up with some distinctions on your own, see how they compare to the distinctions I'm going to talk to you about. So the difference between something like a homework assignment versus asking questions in class is the kind of data that we're collecting. And when we talk about formal, we're talking about assessments that collect the same information from all students. And so what that means is I'm giving the same homework worksheet to every student in my class. So I'm getting the same information from everybody, right? Whereas if I'm asking questions in class, it's unusual that I would ask everybody the same question. So I wouldn't say, okay, Brianna, would you tell me the definition of informal assessment? George, would you tell me the definition of informal assessment? Alex, would you tell me the definition of informal assessment? Jeremy, would you tell me the definition of informal assessment? It would be unusual that I would ask everybody the same assessment. And so when we talk about informal assessment, it's still data on student learning, right? We're still talking about assessment. I'm still able to see, okay, how well are you understanding the content? But I'm not collecting the same information. I'm collecting different information from different students. So let's talk about this in terms of content. So first, for formal assessment, everyone in my class receives the same assessment. So I'm collecting the same data from everyone. Whereas in informal assessment, I'm collecting different data from different students. So I may ask, Brianna, what is the definition of formal assessment? And I may ask Chelsea, well, what's the definition of informal assessment? So I'm assessing data from, with informal assessment, I'm getting different data from different students. Also, hopefully you knew that with formal assessment, I'm getting information from everyone. Whereas when I'm talking about informal assessment, I'm getting sample data. So what that means is I may ask a couple of people questions, but I don't have information on every single student in my class. So I'm just sampling data. So when I'm talking about formal assessment, I'm able to draw conclusions about everybody. Whereas when I'm talking about informal assessment, I'll add that on here, I'm not able to draw individual conclusions. I'm not able to say, okay, does every single student in my class know the answer to this question? So what I'm doing is by asking a few students a few questions, I'm getting data, I'm getting class-wide data, right? So no individual data, it's class-wide, because I'm getting a sense of, okay, is generally the class with me? Whereas meaning that I have information for everybody means that I have individual data for students. That's why sometimes people say if we talk about formative assessment, it's not high point value, but a little bit of point value. Formal formative assessment can be graded. So I can give everybody, for example, completion scores for homework. Whereas when we're talking about informal assessment, that's always ungraded because I'm always collecting different data from everybody, because I'm not collecting the same information from all of my students. And so because I'm collecting the same data for formal assessment, from the teacher perspective, formal assessment tends to be planned. So if I'm collecting data from all my students, I plan that ahead of time. So I think about what homework assignment am I going to give them, or what worksheet am I going to give them. Whereas when we talk about informal assessment, it tends to be more spontaneous. So I may ask a question during class, or I may ask students to thumbs up if they're with me, but it happens more spontaneously. That doesn't mean that I don't prepare questions, but it's not as deliberate as what we're talking about when we talk about formal assessment. And so we talked about two examples, so asking questions as informal and giving a homework assignment as formal. And we can talk about some borderline cases. So something like exit tickets. Is that formal or is that informal? And so you can pause the video here and make a case for formal or informal. I'll give you another border case. Thumbs up in class. So if I say thumbs up if you're with me, is that formal or informal? And so pause, see if you can justify it. What I would say in terms of your justification, what you should be thinking about, is if I am going through the exit tickets and I have an exit ticket for every student and I ask them to answer the same question instead of saying something like, well, write down anything you know, or 3 new things you learned today. If I'm asking my students the same exit ticket question and I'm looking at data for everybody, that feels more formal to me. But if I'm just kind of going through the exit tickets, just kind of flipping through them to see if people are generally with me, I'm not systematically collecting the same information from everybody, then that feels more informal. Likewise, if you think about kind of thumbs up, yeah, all students are doing it, but I'm not focused on individual level data, right? In terms of informal assessment, I'm just getting a little bit of data from different students. And so I'm kind of doing a room check to see if there's kind of enough thumbs up. And so because I'm looking at things on a class-wide level, that would be considered more informal for me. And so when we talk about types of assessment, now we can move on to kind of the last slide that we're going to talk about in this video. We can talk about formal and informal, formative and summative assessment. And I'm going to pause this video right here. There'll be one more video. But what I'm going to ask you to do is come up with an example of formal and informal, formative and summative assessment.